November 1944. Somewhere in the HU Regen forest along the German-Belgian border, the air is cold enough to burn the lungs. A German lancer, a common infantryman, crouches behind the shattered trunk of a pine tree, his uniform caked in mud and frost. His hands tremble, not from fear, from hunger. He hasn't eaten in 2 days. The supply trucks stopped coming weeks ago. His company has been reduced to shadows. 30 men became 12, then 6. Now, just him. The sound of boots crunching through snow. American voices low and cautious. He closes his eyes. He has heard the stories. What the Americans do to prisoners. What everyone does to prisoners. He has seen what his own side did to Russian POWs. He raises his hands. 2 G's appear through the fog, rifles raised. One is young. The other signals with his hand. No shots. Just orders. Get up. Hands on your head. They search him. Take his rifle, his knife, his letters from home. Then one of them pulls something from his pack. A canteen. He unscrews the cap and hands it over. Drink. The German hesitates. Then he drinks. It is not water. It is hot coffee. His eyes widen. He looks up at the American soldier, confused, disbelieving. And for the first time in months, something inside him breaks that is not his body. By the autumn of 1944, the German war machine was collapsing from within. The Wehrmacht, once a symbol of mechanized invincibility, had been ground down across 3 fronts. In the east, the Red Army was steamrolling through Poland and the Balkans. In Italy, Allied forces had breached the Gothic line. And in the west, after the breakout from Normandy in August, American, British, and Canadian forces were racing toward the Rhine. But the collapse was not just tactical. It was existential. German soldiers were starving. Supply lines, severed by relentless Allied air superiority, had turned into ghosts. Trains that once carried ammunition and rations now sat as burning wreckage along French rails. Trucks were abandoned for lack of fuel. Horses, already overused since the invasion of Russia, were dying in the thousands. By November, entire divisions were subsisting on half rations, or less. Frontline units reported receiving only bread and ersatz coffee, a bitter acorn-based substitute that tasted like dirt and offered no warmth. The men knew the war was lost. They had known since Stalingrad or Kursk or D-Day. The exact moment varied, but the understanding was universal. Yet they fought on, some out of loyalty, others out of fear. The SS and the Feldgendarmerie, military police, patrolled behind the lines, hanging deserters from lampposts and trees. Signs were nailed to their chests. I was too cowardly to defend the fatherland. Propaganda still blared from radio sets in command posts, proclaiming miracle weapons and inevitable victory. Goebbels spoke of wonder weapons, of the Virgil-Tungswaffen, the V-1 and V-2 rockets pounding London, of jet fighters that would sweep the skies clean. But the soldiers in the mud heard only lies. They saw the reality: their friends were dead, their cities were rubble, and the Americans had more of everything. More tanks, more planes, more artillery, more food. The contrast was staggering. While German units scrounged for potatoes and horse meat, American soldiers ate from tin cans stamped with labels like beef stew and fruit cocktail. The U.S. Army's logistical apparatus was the most advanced in human history. Every day, thousands of tons of supplies flowed across the Atlantic, through the port of Antwerp, and onward to the front. The Americans didn't just fight with bullets. They fought with abundance, and this abundance extended astonishingly to their enemies. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were entitled to humane treatment. They were to be fed, sheltered, and protected from harm. They were not to be tortured or executed. Their captors were required to respect their dignity as soldiers, even in defeat. The United States took this seriously, not out of sentimentality, not out of naivety, but out of calculated pragmatism and legal obligation. The U.S. Army had signed the Geneva Convention. It intended to honor it, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because American and British POWs were held in German camps, and reciprocity mattered. If the Americans treated German prisoners well, there was a chance the Germans might do the same. It was a fragile hope, often betrayed, but it was a hope nonetheless. Moreover, the U.S. military understood the intelligence value of well-treated prisoners. A starving, terrified man would say anything to stop the pain, but a man given food, warmth, and cigarettes, he might talk freely. He might reveal troop positions, unit strengths, supply routes. He might even express doubts about the Nazi cause. So the policy was clear: feed them, clothe them, treat them like human beings. But for the German soldiers, this was incomprehensible. They had been told for years that the Americans were degenerate, weak, soft, controlled by Jews and Bolsheviks, that they would torture prisoners, that surrender meant death, or worse. Nazi propaganda had painted a picture of the Western Allies as barbaric monsters, no different from the Soviets, and the soldiers believed it, or at least they feared it enough to keep fighting when surrender might have been wiser. Yet reality, as it often does, shattered the lie. The American supply chain was a marvel of industrial warfare. Every day, convoys of trucks rolled eastward from Normandy's beaches and the Belgian port of Antwerp, laden with fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Mountains of food. C rations, K rations, D rations, compact, calorie-dense meals designed to keep soldiers fighting in any condition. But beyond that, the U.S. Army brought fresh bread, canned vegetables, coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes. American quartermasters operated mobile bakeries that could produce thousands of loaves daily. Field kitchens served hot meals even within miles of the front lines. This was not luck. It was doctrine. The U.S. military had studied the lessons of the First World War, where poor logistics had led to hunger, disease, and mutiny. They had learned from the British, whose soldiers in the trenches had often been better fed than their German counterparts, maintaining morale even in the worst conditions. The Americans took this principle and industrialized it. They understood that a well-fed soldier fought harder, longer, and with greater resolve. And they extended this logic coldly and deliberately to prisoners of war. German POWs captured in France, Belgium, and later Germany itself were funneled into a vast network of temporary camps. Some were little more than open fields surrounded by barbed wire, hastily erected to handle the sudden flood of surrenders. Others were more permanent installations, with wooden barracks, latrines, and mess halls. The Red Cross inspected many of these camps, ensuring compliance with the Geneva Convention. Reports from late 1944 and early 1945 consistently noted that American-run camps provided adequate food, medical care, and shelter. The captured Germans could not believe it. Men who had not eaten a full meal in weeks were given bread. Real bread, not the sawdust-filled Kommissbrot they had choked down in the final months of the war. White bread, sometimes soft, warm, accompanied by canned meat, soup, and, most shocking of all, hot coffee. Real coffee brewed from beans, not the roasted acorn substitute that had become a bitter joke among German troops. Some refused to eat at first, convinced it was poisoned. Others wept. The cultural contrast was profound. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the Americans as weak and decadent, a mongrel nation incapable of true discipline or sacrifice. Yet here they were, feeding their enemies, not out of weakness, but out of strength. The Americans had so much that they could afford generosity. It was a devastating realization for men raised on the myth of Aryan superiority and total war. And the contrast with other fronts made it even sharper. On the Eastern Front, where German soldiers had fought with savage brutality, surrender to the Red Army was often a death sentence. Soviet forces, enraged by the atrocities committed on their soil, frequently executed prisoners on the spot or marched them into camps where starvation and disease killed them by the tens of thousands. German soldiers knew this. They had heard the stories from retreating comrades. They had seen what their own side did to Russian POWs, left to starve in open pens, used as slave labor, worked to death. The West was different. Not perfect. Not free of cruelty. There were incidents, of course. Soldiers who shot surrendering Germans in the heat of battle. Guards who mistreated prisoners. But these were exceptions, not policy. The official stance of the U.S. Army was clear: prisoners were to be treated humanely. Orders from Eisenhower's headquarters reinforced this. Commanders were reminded that violations of the Geneva Convention would be investigated and punished. The reasoning was both moral and strategic. Morally, many American officers believed in the rule of law, even in war. They had grown up in a society that valued due process, human rights, and the idea that even enemies deserved a baseline of dignity. This was not universal. There were plenty of Americans who hated the Germans and wanted revenge, but it was widespread enough to influence policy. Strategically, the calculation was simple: well-treated prisoners were valuable. They provided intelligence. They became propaganda tools, living proof that surrender to the Americans was not suicidal. And perhaps most importantly, they reduced resistance. If German soldiers believed that capture meant death, they would fight to the last man, turning every village and bunker into a bloodbath. But if they believed capture meant survival, even safety, they might lay down their arms. And they did. As the American armies pushed deeper into Germany in early 1945, the trickle of surrenders became a flood. Entire battalions walked into captivity, hands raised, eyes hollow with exhaustion. The Ruhr Pocket, encircled in April 1945, yielded over 300,000 German prisoners in a matter of weeks. The logistical challenge was immense. The Americans had to feed, house, and guard a population equivalent to a major city, all while maintaining their advance. They managed it. Field kitchens worked around the clock. Supply officers requisitioned additional rations. Bread was baked in staggering quantities. Coffee was brewed by the gallon. The Red Cross distributed care packages. Medical personnel treated wounds and illnesses without discrimination. For the German prisoners, it was surreal. Many later wrote in letters and diaries that they felt safer as POWs than they had as soldiers. They slept without fear of artillery. They ate regularly. Some even gained weight. It was a strange inversion of everything they had been taught. The propaganda had been a lie. The Americans were not monsters. They were something far more unsettling. They were humane. And that humanity, more than any battle, began to dismantle the foundations of Nazi ideology in the minds of ordinary German soldiers. Private Hans Dietrich, a 22, year-old rifleman from Bavaria, surrendered near Aachen in October 1944. Years later, in a recorded interview, he described the moment with clarity that had not faded. We had been cut off for 3 days. No food, no ammunition, just cold and fear. When the Americans found us, I thought they would shoot us. I had heard the stories, but instead, they gave us water. Then they took us to a tent and there was soup, hot soup. I could not believe it. My hands shook so badly I spilled half of it. One of the Americans, he laughed, not cruelly, just like it was normal. He gave me bread, white bread. I started to cry. I could not stop myself. This was not an isolated reaction. German POWs across the Western Front experienced similar shocks. Men who had been conditioned to expect brutality instead encountered mundane kindness. A cigarette offered, a blanket provided, a medic treating a wound without contempt. These small gestures carried enormous psychological weight. They shattered the narrative that had sustained German resistance. Corporal Friedrich Müller, captured during the Battle of the Bulge in January 1945, later wrote in his diary, "They treat us better than our own officers did. We have more food here than I had in 6 months at the front. I do not understand. We bombed their cities. We killed their soldiers. And yet they feed us." The dissonance was profound. Many German soldiers had been raised in the Hitler Youth, indoctrinated with the idea of racial superiority and total war. They had been taught that the enemy was subhuman, that mercy was weakness, that Germany's survival depended on absolute ruthlessness. And now, defeated and defenseless, they were being shown the very mercy they had been told did not exist. Some broke down entirely. Others became sullen and withdrawn, grappling with the realization that they had fought for a lie. A few clung to their ideology, insisting that the kindness was a trick, a propaganda ploy. But for most, the experience was transformative. The bread and coffee did more than fill their stomachs. It forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had been wrong about the enemy. And if they had been wrong about that, what else had been a lie? The U.S. Army's treatment of prisoners was not charity. It was warfare by other means. Military intelligence officers understood that a cooperative prisoner was worth more than a dozen dead soldiers. German POWs held information troop deployments, supply routes, morale assessments, weaknesses in defensive lines. But extracting that information required trust, or at least a reduction of fear. Interrogation doctrine emphasized rapport, building over coercion. American interrogators, many of them German-speaking Jews who had fled Nazi persecution, used a combination of psychological insight and simple decency. They offered cigarettes. They spoke calmly. They acknowledged the prisoner's humanity. And more often than not, the prisoner talked. One interrogator, Captain Erich Litzblau, later described his method. "You do not get the truth from a man by threatening him. You get it by making him comfortable. Give him coffee. Let him smoke. Treat him like a soldier, not a criminal. Once he realizes he is safe, he will tell you everything." This approach yielded results. Intelligence reports from late 1944 onward contained detailed breakdowns of German unit strengths, defensive positions, and supply shortages, all provided by prisoners who had been well treated. In some cases, German officers, disillusioned by the collapsing Reich, voluntarily provided information that helped the Allies plan their offensives. Moreover, the policy of humane treatment served as psychological warfare. Word spread among German troops that surrender to the Americans meant survival. This undermined Nazi propaganda, which insisted that capture meant torture and death. As more soldiers surrendered, the trickle became a torrent. By the spring of 1945, entire divisions were laying down their arms, preferring American captivity to further fighting. General Dwight Eisenhower understood this dynamic. In a directive issued in early 1945, he wrote, "The proper treatment of prisoners of war is not only a legal obligation, but a tactical advantage. A reputation for fairness will encourage surrenders and save American lives." It was cold logic wrapped in decency. But it worked. Feeding millions of soldiers is difficult. Feeding millions of soldiers and their prisoners requires a logistical system of breathtaking scale. The U.S. Army achieved this through industrial precision. Every day, supply convoys transported thousands of tons of food from rear echelon depots to front-line units. Field bakeries operated 24 hours a day, producing fresh bread in quantities that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations of soldiers. Mobile kitchens mounted on trucks followed advancing units, ensuring that even troops in active combat received hot meals. But the system went further. Quartermasters calculated rations not just for American soldiers, but for expected prisoners. As the Wehrmacht collapsed, these calculations became critical. In April 1945, the U.S. Army was capturing German soldiers faster than they could count them. Camps designed for 10,000 held 50,000. The strain was immense. Yet the food kept coming. Supply offices requisitioned additional rations from depots in France and Belgium. The Red Cross shipped in supplemental supplies. Emergency bakeries were established near major POW camps. In some cases, German prisoners were put to work in these bakeries, baking the very bread that would feed them and their comrades. The scale was staggering. By May 1945, American forces held over 2 million German POWs in Europe. Feeding this population required the equivalent of provisioning a major city daily, and they did it. Not perfectly. There were shortages. Some camps struggled, but the overall system held. Compare this to the German logistical situation. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht could barely feed its own soldiers, let alone prisoners. Soviet POWs in German hands starved by the hundreds of thousands. Allied POWs fared somewhat better, but still suffered chronic malnutrition. The contrast was stark and deliberate. The Americans had the resources, the organization, and the will to maintain humane standards even under pressure. This logistical superiority was itself a form of dominance. It demonstrated that the United States was not just militarily stronger, but fundamentally more capable. The German soldiers, sitting in POW camps eating American bread, understood this implicitly. They had lost to a nation that could afford to be generous. The bread and coffee were bullets aimed at the mind. Nazi ideology had constructed an elaborate mythology of American weakness. The United States, according to Goebbels and his propagandists, was a decadent nation, corrupted by capitalism, multiculturalism, and Jewish influence. Its soldiers were soft, undisciplined, and cowardly. They could not withstand hardship. They would crumble under German steel. This narrative sustained German morale, even as the military situation deteriorated. Soldiers believed that if they fought hard enough, long enough, the Americans would tire and withdraw. Germany would negotiate a favorable peace. The Reich would survive. The reality of American treatment shattered this belief. German prisoners found themselves confronted with evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught. The Americans were not weak. They were overwhelmingly strong, so strong that they could afford kindness. They were not cruel. They followed rules even when it would have been easier not to. They were not cowards. They fought with discipline and courage, and then treated their defeated enemies with dignity. This cognitive dissonance was destabilizing. Many prisoners began to question other aspects of Nazi propaganda. If the Americans were not monsters, were the stories about Soviet atrocities exaggerated too? If Germany's enemies could be humane, did that mean Germany's cause was not righteous? The answer for many was a painful yes. Letters written by German POWs and intercepted by military censors reveal this transformation. One soldier wrote to his wife, "I no longer know what we were fighting for. They treat us better here than our own officers did. Perhaps we were the villains all along." Another wrote, "The Americans have shown me more kindness in 1 week than the party showed me in 12 years. I feel ashamed. This psychological collapse was precisely what American policy aimed to achieve. By treating prisoners well, the U.S. Army did not just weaken German resistance on the battlefield. It undermined the ideological foundation of that resistance. It planted doubts that would spread through letters and returned prisoners into the civilian population and even back to the remnants of the German military. The bread and coffee were not just sustenance. They were proof that the Nazi worldview was false. And that proof was more devastating than any bomb. The reaction to American treatment split sharply along lines of rank and ideology. For the average Lancer, the German equivalent of a grunt, the food and kindness were a relief. These men had never been true believers. They had been drafted, trained, and sent to fight. Many harbored private doubts about the Nazi regime, but kept silent out of fear. Capture, paradoxically, was liberation. They could finally stop pretending. They could eat, rest, and wait for the war to end. But for officers, especially those loyal to the Nazi party, the humane treatment was an insult. The SS officers and Wehrmacht hardliners refused to accept the kindness. They saw it as a trick, a ploy to break their will. Some actively discouraged their men from cooperating with interrogators, threatening them even in captivity. In some POW camps, SS men operated in formal command structures, enforcing discipline and punishing those suspected of collaboration. One American camp commander, Colonel James Harrison, noted in his report, "The enlisted men eat gratefully and speak freely. The SS officers refuse to acknowledge our generosity. They maintain military discipline within the camp and treat our efforts with contempt. They are more dangerous now than they were on the battlefield." This internal divide created tension. Ordinary soldiers who accepted American kindness were sometimes labeled traitors by the hardliners. In a few documented cases, SS officers assaulted or even killed fellow prisoners whom they deemed too cooperative. The Americans responded by segregating ideological Nazis from regular soldiers, placing SS personnel in separate camps where their influence could be contained. Interestingly, even among the officer class, cracks appeared. Junior officers, many of them young men who had entered the war with enthusiasm, but had since witnessed its horrors, often fell into the same category as the enlisted men. They were exhausted, disillusioned, and quietly grateful for the treatment. It was the senior officers, the true believers, who remained defiant. General Lieutenant Anton Dossler, captured in Italy, reportedly refused American rations for the first 3 days, insisting it was beneath his dignity. He ate only when his own body forced him to, and even then, he did so with visible resentment. Others, like General G. Blumentritt, accepted the food, but maintained a cold, formal distance. They would not give their captors the satisfaction of gratitude, yet their resistance was ultimately futile. The war was over for them. The bread and coffee kept coming, whether they acknowledged it or not. And in the privacy of their own thoughts, even some of the hardliners must have wondered if the Americans were truly weak and decadent. Why were they winning? The moral gap between American POW camps and those run by the Axis powers was a chasm. German treatment of prisoners varied by nationality and ideology. Western Allied prisoners, British, American, Canadian, were generally treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, though conditions deteriorated as the war dragged on and German resources collapsed. Food was scarce, medical care limited, and forced labor common. But outright murder was rare. Soviet prisoners received no such consideration. Between 1941 and 1945, an estimated 3.3 million Soviet POWs died in German captivity. They were deliberately starved, worked to death, shot for sport, or left to freeze in open fields. Nazi ideology classified Slavs as Untermenschen, subhumans, unworthy of the protections afforded to Western soldiers. The camps were extermination sites in all but name. German soldiers knew this. They had seen the camps. Some had guarded them. Others had simply heard the rumors. And when they found themselves in American hands, many expected reciprocity. They expected revenge. Instead, they received bread. This contrast haunted many German POWs. Corporal Otto Schmidt, captured in Normandy, later Rodi. I had guarded Russian prisoners in Poland. I saw what we did to them. I saw them die. When the Americans captured me, I thought they would do the same. I thought it was justice. But they did not. They gave me food. They treated my wounds. I do not know if I deserved it. The moral weight of this realization was crushing. It forced German soldiers to confront their own complicity. They had fought for a regime that committed atrocities, and now they were being treated with a decency they had not extended to others. For some, this sparked genuine remorse. For others, it was simply too painful to process, and they buried it. The Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners was, if anything, worse. In camps across the Pacific, American, British, Australian, and Dutch POs suffered starvation, disease, forced labor, and routine brutality. The infamous Bataan Death March in 1942 killed thousands. Camps like Changi and the Thai Burma Railway were death traps. Survival rates were abysmal. Yet even in Europe, where the Germans at least nominally respected the Geneva Convention for Western prisoners, the difference was stark. American POW camps provided medical care, adequate food, recreational activities, and even educational programs. German camps offered survival at best. By late 1944, with Germany's infrastructure crumbling, even that became uncertain. The contrast served a purpose beyond morality. It reinforced the message that the Allies represented civilization, order, and law, while the Axis represented chaos, brutality, and barbarism. This narrative was not entirely accurate. The Allies committed their own atrocities, from Dresden to the treatment of German civilians during occupation. But in the specific context of POW treatment, it held. And the German prisoners knew it. They lived it. They ate the evidence every day. April 1945, the Ruhr Pocket. Over 300,000 German soldiers, trapped in an ever-shrinking circle of Allied armor and infantry, faced a choice: die fighting or surrender. Most chose surrender. The collapse came in waves. First, isolated units, battered and starving, emerged from the forests and rubble with hands raised. then entire battalions marching in ragged columns toward American lines. Finally, whole divisions, sometimes still organized under their officers, laid down their arms in coordinated mass surrenders. The Americans were not prepared for this. Field commanders had anticipated resistance. They had expected the Germans to fight street by street, building by building, as they had in other surrounded pockets. Instead, they found themselves processing thousands of prisoners per day, then tens of thousands. The logistics were overwhelming. Temporary holding areas were set up in open fields, surrounded by hastily strung barbed wire. Guards stood watch, but they were vastly outnumbered. A single company of American soldiers might guard 5,000 Germans. Yet there was no violence, no mass escape attempts. The prisoners simply waited. And then the food arrived. Trucks rolled in laden with crates of bread, canned meat, and field rations. Mobile kitchens were set up on the perimeters. Coffee was brewed in massive steel containers. The aroma drifted across the camps, bitter, rich, real. For the German prisoners, many of whom had not eaten a proper meal in weeks, the smell was intoxicating. Private Wilhelm Hoffman, a 20-year-old machine gunner from Debuseldorf, later described the moment. "We had been marching for days, fleeing the Americans. No sleep, no food, just fear. When we finally surrendered, I thought we would be shot or left to starve in a field. Instead, they gave us bread, fresh bread, still warm. I held it in my hands and could not believe it was real. I took a bite and I wept, not from sadness, from, I do not know, relief, shame, all of it at once." The scene repeated itself across the pocket. Thousands of German soldiers, exhausted and hollow-eyed, sat on the ground clutching slices of white bread and tin cups of hot coffee. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite. Others devoured the food in seconds, their bodies demanding fuel after weeks of deprivation. A few simply stared at the bread as if unsure it was real. American soldiers watched with a mixture of pity and detachment. These were the same men who weeks earlier had been shooting at them. Now they sat defeated, broken, grateful for a meal. It was a strange inversion of power, and it made some of the Americans uncomfortable. Sergeant John Hartman, a squad leader from Ohio, later recalled, "I looked at them and saw kids, scared, hungry kids. Sure, they'd been trying to kill us, but now they just wanted to go home. We gave them food because, hell, what else were we supposed to do? Let them starve. We're not like them." That distinction mattered. The Americans knew what German camps looked like. They had liberated some of them. They had seen the living skeletons, the mass graves, the evidence of systematic murder. Treating German POWs well was, in part, a statement, "We are not you." But it was also practical. The sheer number of prisoners made brutality logistically impossible. Executing 300,000 men would have required time, ammunition, and a level of cold-blooded organization that the American military, whatever its flaws, did not possess. Starving them would have created a humanitarian catastrophe and invited retribution against Allied POWs still held in German camps. So the policy held, I feed them, guard them, process them. The Red Cross arrived within days, distributing care packages and inspecting conditions. Reporters embedded with the advancing armies photographed the camps, sending images back to American newspapers. The photos showed orderly lines of German prisoners receiving rations, sitting in open fields under guard, but alive and fed. The captions emphasized American fairness and discipline. Not all camps were models of efficiency. Some struggled with overcrowding and supply shortages. In a few cases, prisoners went days without adequate food, not out of cruelty, but simply because the logistics could not keep pace with the surrenders. But these were exceptions. The overall system, improvised and chaotic as it was, functioned. And the Germans noticed. Word spread rapidly among the remaining Wehrmacht units. Soldiers trapped in other pockets or still fighting delaying actions across Germany heard from comrades that American captivity was not death. It was survival. This knowledge broke the back of German resistance in the West. Units that might have fought to the last man instead negotiated surrenders. Officers who might have ordered suicidal defensive stands instead led their men into captivity. By late April, the trickle of surrenders had become a flood. Near Magdeburg, an entire corps surrendered en masse. In Bavaria, isolated garrisons laid down their arms without firing a shot. The Americans found themselves accepting the surrender of formations they had not even known existed. Each time, the process was the same: disarm, search, feed. The bread and coffee became a ritual, a symbol of the transition from combatant to prisoner, from enemy to ward. It marked the moment when the killing stopped and something resembling normalcy returned. For the German soldiers, it was the first proof that they might actually survive the war. And for many, it was the beginning of a deeper reckoning. The psychological impact of that first meal cannot be overstated. For years, German soldiers had been told that surrender meant annihilation. Propaganda films showed caricatures of brutal American gangsters and Soviet barbarians. Leaflets warned that capture meant torture, execution, or slavery. The message was clear: fight to the death, because death is all that awaits you anyway. But the bread was real, the coffee was hot, and the Americans improbably kept their word. Sergeant Klaus Weber, captured near Remagen in March 1945, later described his interrogation: "I expected violence, threats. Instead, the American officer spoke perfect German. He offered me a cigarette. He asked about my family, where I was from, if I had children. Then he asked about my unit. I told him everything, not because I was weak, but because what was the point of lying? The war was over, he knew it. I knew it, and he had treated me like a human being." This was the genius of American interrogation policy. By establishing trust, even superficial trust, they gained cooperation. German prisoners revealed troop strengths, supply routes, defensive positions, and morale assessments. This intelligence proved invaluable as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany. But the intelligence value was only part of the story. The real climax was ideological. Nazi doctrine had rested on a foundation of racial superiority and total war. Germans were told they were fighting for survival against subhuman enemies who sought their complete destruction. Compromise was impossible. Mercy was weakness. The only options were victory or death. The Americans obliterated this narrative without firing a shot. By treating prisoners with basic decency, they proved that the Nazi worldview was a lie. The Allies were not subhuman. They were not bent on extermination. They were soldiers, yes, and they fought hard. But they also followed rules. They honored treaties. They saw their enemies as human beings, not vermin to be exterminated. This realization spread like wildfire through the POW camps. Men who had believed in the Nazi cause began to doubt. Conversations in the camps, monitored by American intelligence, revealed a profound shift in thinking. One intercepted letter, written by a captured corporal to his wife, read, "Liebling, I do not know how to say this. Everything we were told was wrong. The Americans are not monsters. They have given us more food than we saw in months at the front. They treat us fairly. Some even speak kindly. I think we were lied to. About everything. Another prisoner, a former Hitler Youth member, wrote, "I believed in the F we her. I believed we were the master race. But how can that be true when we are starving and defeated, and our enemies are strong and generous? I do not understand anymore." This crisis of faith was exactly what American psychological operations had hoped to achieve. Leaflets dropped over German lines in the final months of the war had promised fair treatment to those who surrendered. Many German soldiers had dismissed these as propaganda, but now, sitting in POW camps with full stomachs, they realized the leaflets had told the truth. The contrast with the Eastern Front was inescapable. German soldiers who had fought in the East knew what happened to those captured by the Soviets. They had heard the stories, or witnessed them firsthand: summary executions, forced marches to Siberia, starvation in camps where survival was measured in weeks, not years. The Western Allies offered something the Soviets did not: a future. This knowledge accelerated the collapse of German resistance. In the final weeks of the war, entire units fled westward, desperate to surrender to the Americans or British rather than the Russians. The roads leading west became choked with German soldiers, many still armed, marching away from the Soviet advance and toward Allied lines. When they arrived, they surrendered en masse, and the process repeated: disarmament, processing food. The Battle of Berlin raged in the East while the West fell quiet. German soldiers in Bavaria, in the Ruhr, in the Netherlands, laid down their weapons and became prisoners. The war for them was over. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The following day, victory in Europe was declared. But for the millions of German POWs already in Allied custody, the war had ended weeks earlier. The moment they received their first slice of American bread, the final act of the climax was not a battle. It was a meal. In camps across Western Europe, German prisoners sat in the spring sunshine, eating rations provided by their former enemies. Some wrote letters home, carefully worded to pass censors, describing their treatment. Others simply sat in silence, processing the strangeness of their situation. They had expected death and found life. They had expected cruelty and found fairness. It did not erase their guilt. It did not undo the atrocities committed in Germany's name. But it gave them something they had not expected: to receive a second chance. And in that moment, sitting with bread in their hands and coffee warming their bellies, many of them understood a truth they had spent years denying they had been wrong. About the war, about the enemy, about everything. The bread was not just food. It was the physical embodiment of their defeat, not on the battlefield, but in the realm of ideology. Nazi propaganda had promised that German superiority would triumph over Allied decadence. Instead, Allied decency had triumphed over German barbarism. The prisoners could see it, taste it, and there was no denying it anymore. The war in Europe ended, but the prisoners remained. By May 8, 1945, American forces held over 2 million German POWs scattered across camps in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany itself. The British held another million. The logistical challenge of managing this population was staggering. These men needed to be fed, housed, medically treated, and eventually repatriated. But to where? Germany was a shattered nation, divided into occupation zones, its cities reduced to rubble, its infrastructure destroyed. The Allies made a decision: hold them for now. process them slowly, and in many cases send them across the Atlantic. Between 1943 and 1946, over 370,000 German POWs were shipped to the United States and held in camps scattered across the country. They were distributed strategically away from major cities and coastal areas, placed in rural regions where escape would be difficult and contact with the civilian population limited. Camps appeared in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and dozens of other states. For the Germans, America was a shock greater than any they had experienced in Europe. The camps themselves were austere but humane. Rows of wooden barracks, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, housed the prisoners. But inside, conditions were better than most German soldiers had experienced even before capture. They slept on cots with mattresses. They had access to showers and latrines. They received 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, provided according to U.S. Army rations, which were far more generous than German military rations had ever been. The food continued to astound them. White bread, butter, canned vegetables, meat, milk, coffee, real coffee. Some prisoners gained 20 or 30 pounds within months. They had never eaten so well, not even in peacetime Germany. But it was not just charity. The Geneva Convention required that POWs be fed at the same standard as the captor nation's troops. And the U.S. Army complied rigorously. Red Cross inspectors visited the camps regularly, filing reports that confirmed adequate food, sanitation, and medical care. Violations were rare and, when discovered, addressed. The prisoners were also put to work. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted men could be required to labor, though officers could not. German POWs worked on farms, harvesting crops and tending livestock. They worked in lumber camps, cutting timber. They performed maintenance tasks on military installations. They were paid for their labor, 80 cents per day in scrip, which could be used in the camp canteens to buy cigarettes, chocolate, toiletries, and other small luxuries. For many, this was the strangest part. They were prisoners of war, yet they were being paid. They worked, but they were not slaves. They were guarded, but not brutalized. The cognitive dissonance persisted. Farmer John Peterson in Nebraska hired German POWs to help with his wheat harvest in the summer of 1945. He later recalled, "They worked hard, didn't complain. At the end of the day, we'd sit on the porch and my wife would bring out lemonade. They'd drink it and look around at the fields, the sky, the barns. One of them said to me in broken English, 'This is not war.' I said, 'No, son, it's not.' The prisoners adapted. Some learned English. Others took correspondence courses offered through the YMCA and the Red Cross, studying subjects ranging from mathematics to literature. Camp libraries were stocked with books, including German-language texts. Recreation was encouraged. Prisoners formed soccer teams, theater groups, and orchestras. Concerts were held in the camps, attended by both prisoners and occasionally local civilians. This was not an accident. The U.S. War Department had developed a re-education program aimed at dismantling Nazi ideology and fostering democratic values. Prisoners attended lectures on American government, watched films depicting the horrors of the concentration camps, and were encouraged to discuss their beliefs in supervised settings. The program was met with mixed results. Some prisoners were receptive, genuinely horrified by the evidence of Nazi crimes. Others remained defiant, clinging to their ideology. Most fell somewhere in between, confused and uncertain. What could not be denied was the physical reality of their situation. They were alive. They were healthy. and they were being treated, by any objective measure, far better than Germany had treated its enemies. The contrast haunted them. Mortality rates in American-run POW camps were extraordinarily low. Of the 370,000 German prisoners held in the United States, fewer than 1,000 died during captivity. Most of those deaths were from illness or accidents, not mistreatment. The survival rate exceeded 99%. Compare this to the German treatment of Soviet POWs, where the mortality rate exceeded 50%, or the Japanese treatment of Allied POWs, where 1 in 3 died. The difference was not subtle. It was a moral chasm, and the German prisoners knew it. In letters intercepted by censors, in conversations overheard by guards, in diaries kept secretly and later recovered, the same themes emerged again and again: disbelief, shame, gratitude, confusion. They had been prepared to die. Instead, they had been given life. By 1946, repatriation began in earnest. The process was slow, deliberate. Prisoners were screened for war crimes involvement. Those cleared were gradually shipped back to Europe and released into the shattered remnants of their homeland. Those suspected of serious crimes were held for trial. The return was jarring. Germany in 1946 was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were homeless. Food was scarce, rationed tightly by the occupying powers. The economy was non-existent. The political structure had been obliterated. The nation was divided, occupied, defeated in every sense. The returning POWs brought with them stories of abundance, of fairness, of a nation so wealthy it could afford to feed its enemies. These stories spread, creating a strange cognitive dissonance among the German population. They had lost the war, but some of their soldiers had been better off as prisoners than as free men in the ruins of the Reich. It was a bitter realization, but an undeniable one. The long-term impact of American POW treatment extended far beyond the war itself. For the individual prisoners, the experience was formative. Many returned to Germany with altered worldviews. They had seen a different way of life, a different kind of society. They had witnessed industrial abundance, democratic governance, and a legal system that, for all its flaws, attempted to adhere to principles of fairness. Some became advocates for democracy in post-war Germany. Others simply carried the memory privately, a quiet counter, narrative to the Nazi ideology they had once believed. Ernst Floder, a former Wehrmacht soldier who spent 2 years in a POW camp in Colorado, later became a teacher in West Germany. In interviews conducted in the 1980s, he spoke openly about his captivity. The Americans showed me that strength and decency are not opposites. I had been taught that mercy was weakness, that only brutality could win wars. But they defeated us, and they did it without becoming monsters. That lesson shaped everything I taught my students afterward. His story was not unique. Thousands of returning POWs integrated into post-war German society carrying similar lessons. They became businessmen, teachers, civil servants, craftsmen. And in subtle ways, their experiences influenced the reconstruction of German culture. The Federal Republic of Germany, established in 1949, embraced democratic principles and rejected militarism. This transformation was not solely due to POW experiences. Of course, the horrors of the Nazi regime and the devastation of defeat played far larger roles. But the treatment of prisoners contributed to a broader recognition that Germany had been on the wrong side of history. Not all returnees were transformed. Some remained bitter, clinging to their ideology, insisting that Germany had been betrayed rather than defeated. A few joined right-wing movements in the post-war years, attempting to keep Nazi ideals alive. But these were the minority. Most simply wanted to rebuild their lives and forget the war. The psychological impact was complex. Many former POs struggled with guilt. They had survived while millions of their comrades had died. They had been fed while German civilians starved in the rubble. They had been safe while their cities burned. Survivor's guilt is a universal phenomenon, but for German POs, it was compounded by the knowledge that their survival had come at the hands of the enemy they had tried to destroy. Some never spoke of their captivity. Others spoke of it obsessively, as if trying to make sense of the contradiction. How could the Americans have been so humane when Germany had been so brutal? The question had no easy answer, and it lingered. The contrast became even sharper as information about Soviet treatment of German POs became public. Over 3 million German soldiers were captured by the Red Army. Roughly 1/3 died in captivity, starved, worked to death, or executed. Those who survived were often held for years beyond the war's end, used as forced labor in Soviet reconstruction projects. The last German POs held by the Soviets were not released until 1956, more than a decade after the war ended. German families knew this. They understood that capture by the Americans or British meant a reasonable chance of survival and eventual return. Capture by the Soviets often meant death or years of suffering followed by return to a homeland that had moved on without them. This knowledge influenced Cold War dynamics. West Germany, rebuilt with American aid under the Marshall Plan, became a staunch ally of the United States. The memory of American treatment of POs was one small factor among many, but it contributed to a broader sense that the Western Allies were preferable partners to the Soviet Union. The Marshall Plan itself mirrored, on a national scale, the logic of POW treatment. By investing in Germany's recovery rather than crushing it utterly, the United States demonstrated that it preferred partnership to vengeance. The German people, exhausted and defeated, responded. West Germany became one of the great success stories of post-war reconstruction, a prosperous democracy firmly aligned with the West. Meanwhile, in the United States, the presence of German POWs left its own mark. Americans who had interacted with the prisoners, farmers who hired them, guards who watched them, locals who saw them working in fields, came away with complex impressions. Some saw the prisoners as proof that not all Germans were Nazis, that ordinary soldiers had been caught up in something beyond their control. Others remained suspicious, viewing the Germans as defeated enemies who did not deserve kindness. There were tensions. In a few cases, local populations protested the presence of POW camps, fearing escape or sabotage. In other cases, friendships formed. American guards and German prisoners sometimes shared cigarettes, played cards, or exchanged stories. These interactions humanized the enemy, breaking down the propaganda stereotypes that had sustained the war effort. After the prisoners were repatriated, many of the camps were dismantled. The barracks were torn down, the barbed wire removed. The land was returned to its previous use, farmland mostly. Today, few physical traces remain. Occasionally, a historical marker notes that a POW camp once stood on the site, but the memory persists in local histories and family stories. Some former POs returned to the United States years later as immigrants, drawn back to the country that had once held them captive. They settled in the same towns where they had been imprisoned, married American women, raised families. It was a strange full circle, from enemy soldier to prisoner to immigrant to citizen. One such man, Reinhold Pabel, had escaped from a PO camp in Illinois in 1945 and lived under a false identity in Chicago for years. When he was finally discovered, he was not deported. Instead, he was allowed to stay. He later wrote a memoir describing his experiences, noting with irony that the country he had fought against had ultimately given him a better life than the country he had fought for. The broader historical legacy is undeniable. American treatment of German POWs stands as one of the war's clearer moral contrasts. It was not perfect. There were failures, abuses, moments when the system broke down. But as a matter of policy and practice, it represented an adherence to the rule of law even in the midst of total war. This mattered. It mattered legally, as evidence that the Geneva Conventions could be honored even under strain. It mattered psychologically as a counter-narrative to Nazi propaganda. And it mattered morally as proof that victory did not require becoming as brutal as the enemy. The bread and coffee were small things, material necessities, but they carried weight far beyond their immediate utility. They were symbols of a choice, the choice to remain human, even when dealing with those who had embraced inhumanity. And in the end, that choice helped shape the post-war world in ways both tangible and intangible, rippling forward through decades of German-American relations, Cold War alliances, and individual lives quietly transformed. War is often remembered for its violence, the battles, the bombings, the millions dead. But history also turns on quieter moments. A cup of coffee, a slice of bread, a gesture of decency when cruelty would have been easier. The American treatment of German POWs was not motivated by idealism alone. It was calculated, strategic, grounded in law and self-interest. Yet in execution, it became something more. It became a statement about what kind of nation America aspired to be, even in the depths of global conflict. It said, "We will not become what we are fighting against." For the German soldiers who experienced it, the impact was profound and lasting. The bread they received was not just sustenance. It was the collapse of a worldview, the unraveling of years of propaganda, the first glimpse of a truth they had been trained to deny, that strength and humanity are not incompatible, that the enemy can be both victorious and merciful. Decades later, some of those men would tell their children and grandchildren about the moment they surrendered, about the fear that gripped them as they raised their hands, and about the strange, disorienting kindness that followed. The hot coffee on a cold morning, the bread that tasted like hope. These small acts did not erase the horrors of the war. They did not absolve anyone of guilt or wash away the blood. But they did something perhaps equally important. They reminded everyone involved that even in war, humanity could survive. That even in the presence of enemies, dignity could be preserved. That the rules we create in peacetime about how to treat prisoners, how to conduct war, how to remain civilized, can hold if we choose to honor them. The bread and coffee were not miracles, they were choices. Choices made by soldiers, officers, and policymakers who believed that doing the right thing, even for the enemy, was worth the effort. And in the end, those choices mattered. They shaped the peace that followed, the alliances that formed, the world that emerged from the ashes. Because the opposite of cruelty is not weakness. It is bread warm and fresh, offered to a man who expected to die. It is coffee hot and bitter, shared with an enemy who has laid down his arms. It is the quiet recognition that the war may be over, but our humanity must endure.